In 1979, the Drug Enforcement Administration's estimate of worldwide cocaine production and availability was 14 metric tons, 14 metric tons. Today, their estimate is 178 metric tons.
Paul Eddy is an investigative reporter who has explored the financial and criminal history of the cocaine wars.
Cocaine is unique, I think, in that it's possible because it only grows successfully in Bolivia and Peru to any great extent, and because the Colombians have managed to gain this almost total monopoly over the production and transportation of cocaine, is that we have a very well-directed, sophisticated, organized conspiracy that's allowed it to flood this country.
This is Olive Graham. This week's program on Forum provides our listeners with an opportunity to understand why there is a war on drugs, particularly cocaine. Paul Eddy, along with Hugo Sabagal and Sarah Walden, has written The Cocaine Wars, an account of the growth and development of cocaine as an international industry in the last 10 years. The writers sought to find out who is responsible, who makes the profits, how they get away with it, who tries to stop them, and why that doesn't seem to happen. Mr. Eddy describes the effectiveness of the Medellin Cartel that dominates the trade.
It is an extremely flexible body that adapts to problems and pressures. And so, for example, if law enforcement is successful in Florida, which is the front door of America, it's where most of it comes in most of the time, and begins to make a successive number of large seizures, then what you will see the cartel do is change method of smuggling. They'll change directions. It'll come in over the Gulf Coast. It'll come in over the Mexican border, over the Canadian border. They've brought it in the cargo holds of 747s. They've brought it in on freighters off Long Island, off the Oregon coast. It's come in orchids. It's come in dissolved in wine. There seems to be no end to the ingenuity that they will employ to get it in. And given the borders of this country, how large they are, it isn't particularly difficult. In fact, I think they think it's more difficult getting the money out than it is getting the drugs in. They lose battles in the war, the cartel, but there's no question that they're winning the war itself.
Who are some of the major players that our listeners would immediately recognize?
We think there are three. Interestingly enough, all three of them appear in Fortune magazine, which has its annual list of billionaires, the richest men in the world. And all three of these men now appear on this list. The first, and we think the most important, is a man called Jorge Ochoa, now aged 40 years old. He's the middle son of a rancher come landowner in Colombia. He's, I think, an intelligent, resourceful, clever man who, if he wasn't running the cartel, would probably be running a major corporation. Serving with him at the top of this organization is a man called Pablo Escobar. His background is somewhat different. He started off as a petty thief in Medellin. He used to steal gravestones from the graveyards and rub off the inscriptions and then resell them to the newly bereaved. Later a car thief. He and Ochoa were in the United States at the same time when they were there as witnesses to the growing demand. And they began to cooperate together in 1981 after Ochoa's sister had been kidnapped by M19 guerrillas and held for ransom. And instead of paying ransom, what the Ochoa family did was to call a meeting of all of the traffickers, all of the trafficking families, all of the mafia as they call it themselves. And there were some 200 of them who gathered together in Cali. And they set up a body called Death to Kidnappers, which then printed thousands upon thousands of leaflets that were scattered all over Colombia, offering rewards for information about anybody who kidnapped mafia people or their families. And they declared war on them. They declared that they would be executed. If the kidnappers couldn't be caught, then their families would be executed. And for a while, this is precisely what happened, until Ochoa's sister was released unharmed. And the guerrillas, instead of regarding the traffickers as victims, came to regard them, I think, sensibly from their point of view, as associates. They had common cause and common interest. And so in return for guns and money, which is what the guerrillas wanted, they, instead of fighting the cartel now worked with it. They would guard airstrips. They would even carry out assassinations and things like that. That experience taught Ochoa and Escobar in particular the benefits of cooperation, how instead of fighting each other and being rival and disparate groups, they should work together. They formed something called Medellin Company and took into that partnership the third member of the team, a man known as Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, who comes not from Medellin but from Bogota, the capital of Colombia. These three are now what they call the holders of the quota. If you think of the cartel as the Boeing Aircraft Corporation, because it works in rather a similar way, just as Boeing brings together hundreds if not thousands of subcontractors who make the bits and pieces that go into its aeroplanes, the cartel uses hundreds if not thousands of small groups who are involved in every stage of the processing, the smuggling and the distribution. And Ochoa, Escobar and Rodriguez Gacha are the holders of the quota. They decide which groups get how much of each particular shipment. As a result, never are there eggs in one basket. At any one moment there are dozens, maybe scores of consignments passing through different hands, coming in via different routes and different methods, which is why it's so difficult to stop them. They are extremely wealthy, no question of it. But besides that, they've also gained an authority and a power that I think in Colombia is greater than the central government. There are parts of Colombia where they provide the social services. They provide schools, money for the poor, food. They construct soccer pitches for the children to play on. And they have more respect than central government. They're certainly more feared because whilst they will use bribery of the sort I've just described, but also the subversion of officials, of judges, of policemen by direct outright payments, if that doesn't work, then they will kill people. The Colombian government says that their war on drugs is not a war of words, implying that in America that's precisely what it is. And they're right. Thousands of people have been killed in Colombia for trying to stand up to the traffickers.
Well, they lost part of their Supreme Court.
They lost half the judges of the Supreme Court, who it was thought were in favor of renewing an extradition treaty with the United States. Before that could happen, they were killed. 11 out of 24, and the 12th was killed a few days later. They've killed the Justice Minister. They've killed the Attorney General. They will pursue their perceived enemies anywhere. There was one former minister who had so upset the cartel that his government sent him abroad for his own safety, and he was posted to Hungary behind the Iron Curtain. And the cartel sent gunmen to Budapest, where they shot him in the street. They've come to the United States and killed people in the street.
At what points have our legal system run up against the higher levels of this operation?
Well, unfortunately, almost never. I mean, we've tried very hard. There's a reward offered by the United States Congress for George Ochoa's arrest. They will pay $500,000 to anybody who can secure his arrival in this country. Ochoa has been arrested twice. Once in Spain, where he was held for extradition for almost 2 years, where the United States, in my view, lost what small chance they had of getting their hands on him by complicating it. They complicated it by introducing into the case against him what became known in Spain as the Nicaraguan factor, by inserting the allegation that the cartel was running cocaine through Nicaragua with the connivance and help of the Sandinista government, which on one occasion may well have been true, but nevertheless was what happened in Spain is that it became to be regarded as a political case and not a criminal case. The result was that Ochoa was not sent back to the United States. He was sent back to Colombia, where he was almost instantly freed. He was later arrested towards the end of last year in Colombia. His two brothers, he has one older and one younger brother, and Pablo Escobar went to see the judge in Medellin. I do not know what passed between the judge and the three people, but I do know the result. The result was that the judge issued an order that Ochoa should be released, and he was released from jail, where he emerged arm in arm with the prison governor, was taken to the airport and put on an executive jet and disappeared and has not been seen since. Pablo Escobar, the only success we've had with him is forcing him to resign as a congressman. He was actually an alternate congressman in the government in Colombia. And whilst he was able to maintain the fiction that he was a businessman, benefactor, politician for a while, eventually there was enough American publicity and pressure to embarrass him into resigning. But again, we've come nowhere near to getting him. And frankly, I think by now it's almost irrelevant whether Ochoa and Escobar and Rodriguez Gacha are captured or killed, because the organization they have built up is now so large and so experienced that waiting in the wings are 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 young Turks who want to take over, and behind them there are another 500. In fact, we're already seeing evidence that some of these young men are pushing themselves to the top and think it's time the Ochoas and the Escobars stood down. They're rich enough, they've done it for long enough now. It's almost like arresting the board of directors of the Ford Motor Company and hoping that'll stop the manufacture of automobiles. I mean, it's no longer going to happen. And so long as so many Americans want to use illegal drugs, and the figures are astonishing, Americans spend twice as much on illegal drugs as they do on gasoline every year. And with that sort of market, $100 billion available, you're always going to have some kind of cartel bringing in cocaine. Cocaine is the most seductive of drugs, whilst the popularity and use of all other drugs, legal and illegal, have been falling for the past few years. Cocaine has not. Cocaine has remained the drug of choice. And although there's some evidence that it's peaked in high schools in America, that the class of 87 was less willing to use it than the class of 86, what's happened with the advent of crack cocaine is, of course, that it's crossed the economic boundaries. Crack cocaine, because it's available in a much cheaper form, has now gone down into where it's used by what I call the underclass. And these are people who don't use drugs for a buzz or to enhance their lives. They use drugs because they don't have lives, they don't have hope or money. And the crack cocaine usage in this country is becoming an epidemic. I've been touring this country for the last month, and as I go from city to city, most of them have an appalling crack cocaine problem. And it's not just the use of crack cocaine, drugs being sold openly on the streets and that kind of thing. It's the crime associated with it, violent crime associated with it. Because users who get hooked on it rapidly acquire a very expensive habit, which they can only support by becoming dealers themselves or by resorting to crime. So hold-ups, robberies, muggings, those kinds of things are increasing in most major and even some smaller American cities. More than half the homicides in the United States last year were drug-related.
Is there a difference between the addiction to crack and the addiction to cocaine?
Yes. Crack is a much more potent substance. The method of preparing it and the method of smoking it are both called freebasing, because the idea of the process is to get rid of all the extraneous chemicals that are in cocaine, that are put into cocaine both during the manufacturing process and because cocaine is then cut with some inert substance, lactose or baking powder or something like that, in order to increase its bulk and therefore the profit. Well, when they freebase, they literally cook it. They take this cocaine and cook it in a saucepan with water or ammonia to remove all of these extraneous chemicals. And what they're left with are little rocks. And when those rocks or crystals are heated, they give off a vapor that is almost pure cocaine. It's 80 to 90% pure, which, because they inhale it and take it into the lungs, goes to the brain in a matter of 2 or 3 seconds, producing a high that is much more potent than the high achieved through snorting powdered cocaine through the nose, which is the normal way of taking it. And in laboratory experiments with animals, if you give them cocaine, monkeys and chimpanzees, they will choose cocaine over and above anything, water, sex. They won't smoke marijuana and they won't smoke tobacco, but they will smoke cocaine. There's a particularly famous experiment where, having introduced a monkey to cocaine and having hooked the beast on it, the experimenters then increased the number of times the monkey had to press the bar in order to get one dose of cocaine, to see how far he would go. The people who were conducting the experiment eventually abandoned it because the monkey would press the bar 12,800 times to receive one dose of cocaine. It would go on, in other words, forever if it had to. They will take it until death. We've never seen anything quite like it. It's a remarkable drug.
Has it had the same sort of effect on the Colombian or Bolivian societies?
We've seen epidemics, not of crack cocaine because it's not used widely there, and indeed cocaine in its purest forms, I mean in the form we have it here, is not widely used either. What has happened there is growing use of something called bazooka, which is a mixture of cocaine sulfate. That's one step down from the commercial cocaine we buy, and either tobacco or marijuana. They sprinkle it on tobacco, marijuana, and smoke it, and that's very potent. Where we have seen it happen is in the Bahamas. The Bahamas has been the major transshipment point for cocaine into this country, and whilst that's made some people in the Bahamas extremely rich, members of the government and police officials, for the society as a whole, it's had a devastating effect because the drug has seeped into the local market, as usually happens when drugs are passing through. And I think Nassau in the Bahamas, the capital, experienced the first crack epidemic. This was in 1985. We've really only seen it in the last 2 or 3 years here, but in 85 in the Bahamas, you could see the effect it was having on people. And there are any number of awful stories of, people on a Sunday so desperate to obtain the money to get another dose of crack and unable to by any conventional means, selling their cars for a few $100s just to get the stuff. People selling themselves, and now we see, and these were not what we sometimes like to think of as the sort of the cokeheads, the people hanging around on street corners and that kind of thing. These were bankers and secretaries and people who worked in radio stations and authors and grocery clerks. It's an interesting study done by the Washington Post recently, where they looked at 96 people who'd been arrested for attempting to buy crack who got caught in a police sting operation. And this is precisely what they were. Most of them had never been arrested for anything in their lives. They were middle-aged or young middle-aged people. There was a woman who had 2 children in the back of her car when she went to buy her crack. There were people who worked in banks, people who worked in grocery stores. So it's everywhere, and it seems to have an ability to convince people somehow that it's an acceptable thing for them to do, that it's not going to harm them. I think the perception that people have that cocaine is very harmful is very new and is not getting through yet to a lot of people. And one of the problems we now face is that cocaine, or certainly crack cocaine, is not only on sale in high school in America, it's on sale in grade school now. So that's where drug education has to begin, because 8 and 9 and 10-year-old children are at risk.
But there have been some rather celebrated fatalities where, with what was apparently limited use, there was a heart problem that the cocaine either aggravated or somehow
there are
combined
people
with it.
who've used it apparently once and been killed. The trouble with that is that our propaganda, our Just Say No campaigns, like to concentrate on those, obviously, because they're the warnings
The worst-case scenarios
that we offer. What our propaganda does not acknowledge, however, is that there are millions of Americans who are, in inverted commas, successful users of cocaine. It simply isn't true, as some of the advertisements would have you believe, that if you use cocaine once, that's it, you're hooked. And of course, within the marketplace, the knowledge that people do use cocaine successfully are recreational users, use it to enhance parties or whatever. That gets around just as effectively as the propaganda does, and it makes the children susceptible to not believe the propaganda and to be tempted to try it. Now, I do think the deaths and the publicity given to them are important, and I think there are some studies that show that people in high schools do tend now to believe that cocaine is dangerous. They tend to believe that almost all drugs are dangerous. What worries me is that the people who are now most at risk are not in high school. They're the people who've dropped out. They're the people who are not within the system. They don't have telephones, so they don't take part in these optimistic surveys that say that Americans are now much better educated about drugs. That's what we've got to worry about.
But if they stay up late enough at night, they'll see some of these public service announcements that are on television.
They will, but I suspect that by then it may be too late, because they may be out on the street dealing in it themselves or buying it. You have now in most American cities, certainly most that I've been to, drug supermarkets in the streets. It's easier to buy at night than cigarettes. They don't sell cigarettes on street corners. They do sell crack cocaine.
When you were doing your research for this book, what kinds of materials, what did you have access to as you were constructing this?
We set ourselves the task of looking at Colombia. As I said, one of my co-authors is Colombian, and he spent a lot of time there, and I think has a much better understanding of his countrymen and how they work and what they think than I could possibly have had. We went to the Bahamas to see what was happening there and to study that society, and then we went to Miami to see what had happened in Miami. Interestingly enough, the same thing happens everywhere. The abundance of money that cocaine brings with it colossal greed that literally poisons a society. Miami has the most corrupt police force in America, by far, without question. 1 in 10 of the police force has been tainted by cocaine corruption. It's not just the police, however. It's all of those of us in society who have an ambivalent attitude that whilst we're against drugs and drug trafficking, we'll take their money. So the restaurants, the nightclubs, the bankers, the lawyers, the accountants, the realtors, the car salesmen, men who will take $50,000 in cash in a brown paper bag from somebody who's 20 years old in return for a car, this kind of thing. We wanted to get to know as many traffickers as we could in order to understand why they did it and indeed how they did it. And we were quite successful in that. I wasn't certain that we would find people who were still engaged in the business willing to talk to us. That they did, we were very lucky in finding one particular trafficker called Luis Garcia, who was known as Kojak, because he looked like Kojak, who had retired from the trade, but still knew a great many people in it. And because they trusted him, they trusted us. And I guess people talk to us because it's quite a lonely life being a drug trafficker. If you think about it, the only people you can really talk to are other drug traffickers. You can't very well go home and say, had a bad day, on the drug boat today. And because we weren't an immediate threat to them, I mean, nobody was going to get arrested through talking to us, they were happy as long as we maintained the fiction that they too had retired, and of course what they were talking about was all in the past tense. They were happy to show us how they worked and how easy it is to defeat the efforts of law enforcement. So then we also wanted to get to know the people on the other side, and we spent a lot of time with the undercover narcotics detectives and Drug Enforcement Administration agents. These are the guys in the front line. These are the soldiers. These are the people who risk their lives almost every day. And we were struck by how angry and frustrated they are, because they hear all this rhetoric about, they are winning the war on drugs, and they know they're not. What they do is fight personal battles. They target particular people or particular operations and get personal satisfaction out of putting that man in jail or taking those drugs off the street. But they know perfectly well that while they're doing that behind their back, there are 100 or 1,000 other people operating successfully. And for every load they seize, 9 others get through. I found conditions on the front line almost unbelievable. Undercover narcotics detectives in Miami, of all places, do not work after midnight and at weekends because there's no money for overtime.
What is your personal assessment of where you think this ought to go? What would win the war?
Well, I regard myself as a war correspondent who's returned from the front with bad news rather than as an expert on solutions. I think one of the problems is there aren't any quick solutions, and that's why it's politically unpopular. That's why we only hear about the war on drugs during elections. When the elections are over, it's quietly pushed away in the background. I think there are several things we can do that would make the situation better, and I would not include legalization of cocaine, whilst I think that would reduce the associated crime problem dramatically and it would put the cartel out of business, which I would be very pleased about. I think it's opening a Pandora's box that's just too dangerous. Drug education seems to me one of the routes we have to put far more effort into. We are beginning in grade school now. That's good. Let's do more of that. Let's keep that up. But we also have to be prepared to help the people who, if we don't help them, will become part of a lost generation. I mean, the people who are now using it. And it seems to me ridiculous, if not almost criminal, that 90% of the people who go and seek help because they're addicted to illegal narcotics are turned away. They're told to come back, if they're lucky, in 4 weeks' time. And telling an addict to come back in 4 weeks' time is crazy. Finally, if I were the drug czar, or God for a day, what I would make absolutely mandatory on every agent and agency within the United States government, it would apply to every president and every official of the government, would be that we will not get into bed with so-called allies because they are supposedly anti-communist and turn a blind eye to their facilitation of drug trafficking. The General Noriegas of this world, the Sir Lyndon Pindlings of the Bahamas, and many others. There are people who over the years have believed that the United States has a greater interest than drug trafficking, and that the greater interest is the threat from communism in Cuba and now Nicaragua. Well, it may well be that is a threat, and a dangerous one, but at least there's some way away still. The threat posed by drugs, particularly cocaine to the society, is the enemy in this one is literally at the door. So I would have a rule that could never be broken, that we will have nothing to do with the Noriegas of this world, that all of the sanctions we can possibly apply against those kind of governments will be applied, and that the people of those countries will learn that it's not worth their while to facilitate drugs because the cost is too great. The cost for them is too great. If there was one lesson that I would like Washington to learn from the book, that would be it.
Our guest on Forum has been Paul Eddy.